welcome to the next video, and this video is going to be talking a little bit more about the Age of Absolutism, because that's what we're looking at this point in time. So picture the scene in Europe. You've had the decline in the Roman Catholic Church's authority and power, and this has caused many wars and many conflicts in Europe, whether it's in England, whether it's in France, whether it's in Germany or farther afield. And because the conflict between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants spread so wide, there were many deaths, there were lots of instability, and countries didn't prosper, they didn't grow. And therefore Europe was in a very bad way, and it needed people to take control and to make sure that Europe was once again able to prosper. And this ushered in the Age of Absolutism, in terms of moving on from the expansion and the trade and the exploration side of things to looking more about how kings could rule their countries with absolute power and how they would be able to control their society. So absolutism has these key themes running through it. 1, the divine right to rule. 2, one king, one faith, one law. A centralized mechanisms of the state, and obviously a powerful army. So let's look at the divine right to rule. And basically, if we look at the Catholic Church, they told the people that they had the divine right to rule as well, and that this came from God. And once their power had weakened, then the king said the same thing, that they had the power to rule, and that was given to them by God, that God had picked them to rule over his land. But what are the actual characteristics of a god, any god, irrespective of the religion? Well, you can boil it down to 3 points. The first is that God is omniscient, that he is all-knowing, that God is omnipresent, that he is everywhere, and that God is omnipotent, that he is all-powerful. And therefore, the question that you may want to ask is, well, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing and everywhere, then why does he need a king to rule over his land? And we had an interesting discussion in class today, and the points that you raised was that, well, God will need kings to help spread the message, that in the Bible it's not possible for humans to see God in his form, and therefore kings are needed as sort of stewards of the earth to make sure that everything goes as it should do, and that there is order in society and people are able to live peacefully, well, generally. Not in Europe, because throughout the entire existence of Europe as a continent, it has actually spent more years at war than it has at peace. So, interesting little fact there. The issue is whether the divine right is true or not. And there are arguments to say that, well, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing and everywhere, then why do you need the king? And as I said, the discussions that we had talked about the possible alternatives as to why we would need a king. And these alternatives are valid alternatives and should be used when you come to answer any relevant questions regarding the absolutist period and the divine right to rule. But effectively, what is happening is the divine right to rule has carried on from the Catholic Church, and it's just been replaced by a different individual who is saying pretty much the same things. So it's kind of like when you get a new teacher for a subject, they come in and they're teaching you the same material, it's a different face that you're looking at and listening to. The other area of absolutism is the centralized mechanisms of state. And the mechanisms of state are the 3 main branches, and you have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And the executive is effectively the government. They make policy and they decide what they want to create for their country. The legislature They debate the policy, and hopefully it gets passed into law. Then the judiciary, their role is to make sure that the laws that are passed are enforced and that the laws are applied. The executive and the judiciary, in theory, the executive and the legislature should, in theory, not interfere with the judiciary. And likewise, the judiciary cannot just change the law because it sees that they want to. The judiciary are there to enforce the law and not to make it. But during the period of absolutism, remember that you have all of this conflict, you have all of these struggles, and that society is in pretty much chaos, and you need someone that is able to control the society so that people can prosper and develop. And therefore, the absolutist kings like King Louis and Frederick the Great and Peter the Great, they centralized all of that power and they controlled everything. And the advantages of this centralized power is that yes, you have control, yes, you do have stability, and you're able to make progress. But there is the issue that all of this power in one person's hand can cause corruption. And they do say that while knowledge is power, power also corrupts people. And what you will begin to see as we move on with the lessons and begin to look in more depth at the likes of King Louis and Frederick the Great and Peter the Great is that that power did end up corrupting them to a certain extent, particularly King Louis XIV, because that power led to the French Revolution. And things were never the same. So let's just look at a few people who started life within the absolutist period, but are not given the title of the most awesomest absolutist king in the world. No, that is given to King Louis XIV. So, before King Louis XIV, we have two previous kings. The first one is King Henry. This is a drawing of King Henry. It may look like him, it may not. Anywho, he's wearing a crown, it's a king, and he lives in France. And King Henry created the Edict of Nantes. Nantes is a place in France where the agreement was written, and this was created to create religious tolerance in France, because previously what had been happening is that the Huguenots and the Catholics had been fighting and 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 fighting. So many people died, and the country wasn't able to prosper as you have two main forces fighting each other in one country. So King Henry IV decided that if the Huguenots would be allowed the right to practice their religion to a certain extent in France, then this would stop the conflict between the Catholics and the Huguenots. And he also, as the king, converted to Catholicism, so he became a Catholic, even though previously he was a Huguenot. And one of the reasons he did that was to help promote the religious harmony in France at that point in time. Unfortunately, the guy got stabbed, so he dies. And in his place, his son. Remember, King Henry always wanted a son, so that would carry on his bloodline. And here we have King Henry IV's son, and he is called King Louis XIII. And he's very small. This is to symbolize that he is a weak king. He may have actually been bigger than this drawing in real life. And because he was such a weak king, he needed people around him that could enforce the laws that he wanted to enforce and to ensure and to maintain stability and control in France. And that fell to Cardinal Richelieu. Here he is here. And he was effectively the bulldog of King Louis XIII. And if any of you are fans of the Three Musketeers, then you will see that Cardinal Richelieu is mentioned in there, and he's not a very nice man. And he was a Catholic, and therefore what he wanted to do was to ensure that the king had more control, so he limited the power of the nobles, and he also limited the power of the Protestants. So the good work of King Louis's father, King Henry IV, was beginning to unravel, was being undone by Cardinal Richelieu and King Louis XIII. And then we move on to King Louis the XIV. Now, this guy is known as the Sun King, and he was known as the father of absolutism, that he created the modern state, and that he was the one that pushed France into being one of the most powerful countries in Europe at that time. And the ways that he did it was to gain control. He decided he'd had enough of all of the conflict in his country between the two religions, of the Catholics and the Huguenots, so he decided that there could only be one religion in France, and that was to be Catholic. So the Protestants were persecuted, and many of them had to flee the country to escape persecution. King Louis XIV also built a huge palace of gold and awesome splendor and amazing stuff, and he made sure that everybody knew about it. And he invited the nobles, and he invited people to his court, as it was called, and he would hold court and decide on the laws of the country that should be passed. And he basically was able to use his power and his wealth to control all life in France, therefore showing what can really happen when you can centralize a system. And generally, what you're going to see is, as we look further into the period of absolutism, is competition. And it's kind of like the rivalry between Apple and Samsung. Obviously, this is not a real Samsung product. I would never buy a Samsung product. But if you have one, then you'll see the similarities between Samsung and the Apple products of the iPhone, whether it's the iPad or whatever. And basically what we need to be seeing is the iPhone is King Louis XIV, all right? And the Samsung products, the Samsung phone, the Galaxy Tab, and all the rest of it, these are trying to copy and trying to emulate the Apple product and the work of King Louis XIV. Because that is actually what has happened. If you look at Apple, they have revolutionized how society lives. Began with the iPod, and then you move on to the iPod Touch and the iPod Nano, and then you move on to the iPhone and the iPhone 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the rest of it. And every little development increases ever so slightly, and everybody goes mental and crazy and decides to buy it. And, Samsung are pretty much doing the same thing. So these are two massive companies that are rivals, and they are competing with each other, and they're looking at what the other are doing and then trying to implement that in their own products. And it's pretty much the same thing that happened during the absolutist period of Europe, that you had King Louis, the iPhone, and he started many great things. He built many great palaces, and he held all of the control, so that you see other people like Frederick the Great and Peter the Great working for Samsung and trying to replicate and trying to copy the work of King Louis XIV, because it was successful. An absolutist king must be able to have 100% absolute control over its society and its community. And King Louis XIV was able to do that. And therefore, Frederick the Great and Peter the Great effectively copied. And that brings to an end the video on absolutism. So before we do that, let's just have a quick recap. Absolutism, 1400s to 1800s, and we're looking specifically at 1589 to 1765. And the main elements of absolutism is that you're looking at the concept, the idea of the divine right to rule. This is the system, and this divine right to rule helps maintain order. You have one king, one faith, and one law. Everybody agrees to this system, everybody abides by the system, because if you do not, then you not only disobey the king, you're disobeying God. And if you disobey the king, you're going to lose your head. And most people like their heads to be attached to their bodies. So, you know what? They agreed with what the king wanted. You have the centralized mechanisms of state, which ensures and enables the king to keep control. And always, you need a powerful army to maintain that order in the society and to make sure that there is no issues or problems in society, and if there are, that your army is there to prevent it and to stop it. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.